So here we are. Is this it? Hi.
Here we are. Hi, Juli.
I'm so excited to see your face.
I am so excited to see your face too, Juli, and to be here together to talk about your absolutely transcendent, luminous first novel, Fiebre Tropical.
Yeah.
I love it so much. The first time I read it, it was in paper manuscript form, and I remember spending hours just like opening the pages going, more glory, more glory. And now to get to hold the book and on it, all its shiny fabulousness, and see all the success that it's had in the world as a finalist for the Kirkus Prize and the absolutely deservedly glowing review in the New York Times, and so many other ways in which this book has already inspired people and brought people life, is just phenomenal. So
thank you. I feel like it's such a gift that we're finally able to speak to each other. We were gonna have a conversation for my book launch that I had to first postpone and then just cancel indefinitely. And Kat and I were gonna be in conversation. There was gonna be a drag show. We had like this whole thing planned, and it kind of like crumbled. And so I'm like really happy that like we're finally able to just kind of like come back and have this conversation. So thank you for your willingness to do this. Yeah.
I mean, I had told so many people about the drag show that was going to be part of your book launch party, and they were so excited. And I had my tie all picked out. It was a purple shiny polka. It was like, I had the tie. I was so ready and excited. But we're here and we're in the pandemic, and so much has changed and so much is uncertain, and yet people are still turning to books. And the literary world goes on, and writing still matters, and stories still matter, and stories like yours still matter so much. So maybe we could just dive into talking more about Fiebre Tropical. And I say,
let's do it.
Let's do it. So maybe we could just start with the conception of this novel. It's Inception. Novels can start with burning questions, or there can be a seed that sometimes is planted in our consciousness years before we even start seriously forming the chapters. So I wonder for you, if you could tell us where the seeds were, whether the growth and the sparking of what gave rise to this book happened in your San Francisco State years while you were getting your MFA, or outside or beyond. And what was the burning, force that, you know what? Let's pause because that's crazy. Hold on. So maybe you could tell us more about those seeds, those sparks that gave rise to this incredible book.
Yeah, well, I feel like an inception of the book is many things. I feel like I can point to like a few genesis of it, but I do think that there's like such a like intersection of so many universes that like made this book happen. I can see like specific twofold points. One of them is during my time I got my MFA at SF State in creative writing, and I can't remember exactly which class. I think it's probably was in Nona class. We were writing a short story, and my family, when we moved from Colombia to Miami first, I'm an immigrant, I'm originally Colombian. My mom did join an evangelical Christian church, and I was going to write a story. And I remember when we were there was a conversation about how dead babies needed to be like named and like baptized, kind of like symbolically. And we never actually went through with the baptism of a dead baby. But when I was, writing, I was like, oh, what if we had gone through like the baptism of a dead baby? What would that look like? So I started writing. So that's like kind of like the plot, let's say like the beginnings of like the plot of it. There's a bigger force than that comes from being an immigrant in this country and having to learn English. And that big force is the language part of it, and it's the urgency of the Spanglish that like you see in the book. And again, I'm originally Colombian. I first moved to Miami, and my first encounter with the hybridity of language, with the mixing of language, was in Miami. And I remember the first time that I heard "Te llamo para atrás," which is literally translated from "I called you back" into Spanish. I was in awe. I was like, what is this? And I remember then, I spent 4 years there. In my 4 years there, my grandmother mispronouncing things in like pronouncing things phonetically in Spanish that were in English to also make us laugh, but also because she knew no English whatsoever, and how much I was so attracted to that language, how much I wrote it down in all the notebooks that I had. And so I feel that the genesis of the book definitely has to do both with the plot of the specific events that I remember and I kind of like imagined from there, but also with this language that has been carrying me through in my experience as an immigrant in this country, and in watching the way and the very satirical and dark way in which immigrants blend and make sense of their world by creating this like new phenomenon, basically, to just be able to communicate with each other. So that's what I see as like kind of like the forces that brought this book together.
And that's so, I mean, novels are large worlds, right? And so they can often have multiple streams of urgency kind of pulsing through them. And then that creates a real richness in the book, as this does. So you have it's fascinating to hear about the beginnings of the idea for the dead baby, right? You have like the what if. And you're like, well, what if it had happened? And then you start to kind of write it into being. And I love what you say about the language itself and that convergence of language that is part of the vitality and creativity and innovation of immigrant culture as being part of what kind of called you to bring this voice to life, because there is so much vibrancy in the voice. I mean, just from page 1, it's so alive. And that's part of what kind of drives us through the book. Maybe you could read to us a little bit and let us all in to that amazing voice.
So I love that. So I'm going to read something very short, and we're going to start page 19. If you have the book, is chapter 2. La Tata was obsessed with Don Francisco. Sao Gigante was Jesus before Jesus was Jesus. Even before moving to Miami, homegirl watched him religiously every Saturday, mumbling amorcitos from her rocking chair to the television. Back in Colombia, Tata had visions where she stepped onto Don Francisco set in a glorious dress, spun the magic wheel and won a car, or a kitchen set, or a vacation for 2. She would hold my hand and say, "Ay, Mimi, te imaginas, you and I in Disney World." Once in Miami, she called the 1-800 number several times, leaving detailed messages. Si niña, Alba, that is ALBA. Si Alba, can you tell them to call me back? It's important. In Miami, the Galan dream was close. So close was Tata to having the Chilean-born papi read her name tag, call her from the audience, holding out his arms for her. Alba is la ganadora, he would say. Above everything, she wanted to be the winner. Of what? Of the moment of recognition of that spotlight, of Don Francisco landing a faint kiss on her cheek. Tata would sit in the first row with the rest of the Cuban señoras, but she would be his favorite, the one with the special juju. She would have hung the photograph of Don Francisco with his arm around her, next to the Blessed Woman of the Year certificate from church. If the never-aging papi called, she would wear the dark green dress and the only gold earrings she still owned. She walked down the steps like she once did at Club Unión in Cartagena, sending kisses this way, kisses that way, but this time she would mean it. Pero niña, de Mr. Tumbalo cascó. Y ahí estamos, on the couch, watching Son Señora hold Don Francisco's hand and with Tata's kitchen set. Mírala, Tata said. She doesn't even know how to spin the wheel. I'll stop there. Thank you.
It's just so much richness every time, and hearing you read it is so dynamic. And, you know, in this country right now, with the rise of visible xenophobia against immigrants, you know, a lot of the dominant narrative around immigrants is like I'm an immigrant too, what we take away from society, the threat of us, the danger of us, you know, I mean, there's so many ways that that's even right now, you know, interconnected with the structures of power and bigotry and what's going on with the White House and all that. And then here you have this narrative that does the opposite and turns that inside out and looks at like the vigor and the artistic contributions of immigrant life, right?
Yeah, and also like what we do with language. I mean, I feel that I grew up, you know, when I was in Miami, I would go to school and I would do really bad in everything that was like English or history or stuff like that because I had to write it. And I didn't know like standard English, which is basically just like white English. But then I will go back to like my house or the streets or like the supermarket and like watch all these people like write things in Spanglish, pronounce things wrong, but like being able to communicate with one another. There's so much humor in that. And there's so much brilliance in being able to create a new language, to create a new phenomenon in front of you. I mean, it's really an art. And it's an art that you kind of have to develop an ear for it. And so I see also the development of Spanglish not only as like, you know, like you're moving into English or moving into Spanish, but you're actually just transforming both languages at the same time, right? It's not that you're necessarily just moving from one place to the other. It's like you're really even questioning its borders and just, you know, transforming them. Which I think is also what we do as immigrants. You know, we just transform a place and we bring our own, you know, our own saborcito to like whatever it is that we encounter. And that shifts.
And it is that saborcito. And you can't quite translate saborcito. It's like your own flavor, but the fact that we can say sabor and then call it a saborcito, and like saborcito is a whole different vibe. So you bring that vibe into, you know, a text, you know, published here in the United States. And then you also have, you know, the cultural innovations that are queer culture and identity. So you also have this narrator who is coming into queerness while growing up. Can you talk a little about that, how that vibrates for you, or what it was like to write that that as an aspect of this experience of being in this family?
Yeah, I mean, again, like I said, like I did my mom did join an evangelical Christian church, and we had to go, and it was pretty awful. There was never a Christian daughter of a pastor that I fell in love with, sadly. I wish there was.
That's the fictionalization. That's the what if. Let me write into this what if. Enter Carmen. I'm so glad you invented
Carmen. But it's like, Carmen is also, it was very important to me to tap into this idea of belonging, which I think is huge. And it taps into, I mean, I think a very much like universal theme, but for Franciscan, for the mom and everybody, it's like, and that's very immigrant, it's like just belonging and having a sense of community. And there was a moment when I was writing where like, I didn't know where things were going. And I was like, she needs to be able to join this church. Like she needs to be able to cross into the other side. But not necessarily because of Jesus, but because something grander, and that idea of like love, and that idea of belonging, and that idea of like feeling seen, and that's so huge. And so that's where, like, you know, Carmen comes in, and like Carmen is like such a great character, because she's like so aloof, and just like so funny, and like she just has so much confidence in many things. And it's just like, why are you not embarrassed of doing all this stuff? You know, that it's like kind of like the opposite teenager of what Francisca is. She feels embarrassed by a lot of things in public. And so, you know, Carmen, I feel, is like that kind of like place of connection and hope throughout the novel that gets like in there, that kind of like drives Francisca to do a lot of things. It's, you know, everything is so much shit. She left everything. Her mom is like falling into this church. Her grandmother's an alcoholic. Like all these things are happening, and yet I do think that Carmen kind of creates a little bit of an opening in there for her, to kind of like move her along.
And so then that becomes a really important part of the fabric, or the sort of the greater tapestry of the book and the story.
Yeah. And I never, you know, she never says lesbian. I just also like, it's interesting because like I also grew up in a place where there was no word and no language at all for being queer. I mean, at least in my world, you know, there's definitely like Colombian people who are my age who had a more like open experience, but I didn't. And so I was also really interested in creating queerness without having the language. And it happens also maybe for the grandmother in the grandmother's like story, that there's a sense of like, that there's so much around queerness, there's so much about identity naming and like claiming an identity and like doing other things, but there's so much, and at least it was also my experience, and there's so many people who experience queerness without having language or naming it. And I feel like it's so much more freeing sometimes to just like not have specific names for it.
I mean, I think that's such a deep part. I mean, certainly it's really powerful that we do have this continued proliferation of names and possibilities and ways that we as queer folks can create language around our experiences and identities. And for generations, we existed in all of our LGBTQIA++, you know, glory, without the language around it. And that, I mean, it's one of my obsessions too, is kind of like writing our way into queer experiences pre-labels. And I also, as a child, didn't know that I could be a lesbian, a dyke, a genderqueer person, a bi person, any of those, you know, any and all of it. And so, and I even like, I happen to be rereading, right under your book is The Kiss of the Spider Woman by Manuel Puig.
Oh my God,
You know,
I love that book.
I'm rereading this book,
book.
and it was this really groundbreaking gay novel, and it, among other things, right? And kind of fused Latin American liberations with queer liberation, and how you can't have political liberation without queer liberation. But as I'm rereading it, I'm like, he was pushing the edge of gender so much, and studying his life, like he might have been genderqueer or even trans. Puig himself, I think he may have he may have been a trans woman who never had the opportunity to find that language. So the ways in which, so I bring this up to say, you know, that this idea of like really going beyond language, I think fiction is such a powerful way in to the labels and under and beyond them, that, you know, not to diss labels, but that fiction plunges us into the consciousness of people, so we can see the full depth and nuance and richness of the experience, you know, alongside the label, the one word label. And so maybe we could talk more about the grandmother, because this really powerful thing that this book does, like structurally. So you have Carmen is like a thread in the tapestry, but your tapestry really expands in ways that not all novels that start with a young first person narrator necessarily do, right? You go back in time, we go back to Colombia, we go back generations in the women's experiences in this family. Can you talk about how, did you know from the beginning that was part of it, or did it, you know, come to you along the way? What was your vision for bringing in these powerful generational layers?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like everything in that book was very much unintentional. A lot of the things happen. I was not a writer who sat down to like map it or do any of that. Like, I feel like now I have different skills for writing. But what happened was that I would read a lot of books and be like, oh, this is interesting. Let me try this out on mine. Oh, this is interesting. So I feel like I was picking up from the ways that other people were doing stuff. And that's how I learned how to maybe do structure. That's how I learned how to include some other things. The grandmothers and the mother story, I was actually in Wyoming when I was writing the grandmother story. And I was just sitting with like, I was in this like really beautiful residency, and I was just like sitting with the fact that I wanted them outside of just the relationship as a grandmother and as a mother. And it was really hard if I just kept on being in like, you know, the first person with Francisco Medina as present, to be able to unfold themselves fully. And I wanted to see them as their teenager selves in Colombia, and kind of like just to create a more comprehensive understanding of them, but also to like, you know, as like women are usually just perceived as like the relationship to others. It's like to actually see them just as just others themselves, and as how fucked up they are, and as like, you know, complex and everything. And so, and it was also, you know, my grandmother is from Cartagena, and she did grow up in the 50s, and in a very, very tight, you know, Cartagena circle. And, you know, I had been speaking with her sisters. My grandmother passed away, but I had been speaking with her sisters a lot. I love talking to like really older women. And their stories were just like really amazing. And I started just like figuring out what it would have been like for her to exist in that world, and to have desire. You know, I remember speaking to my grandmother about desire, and it was very uncomfortable for her. When we would sit and watch telenovelas together, I was like, you know, I would be like, oh, grandma, you love when they're kissing. And she's like, no, I cover my eyes when they're kissing. And I was like, you love it. And, you know,
were you right? Who was right? Were you right?
She loves it. Yeah. But it was like, there was so much repression, you know, and like she was never taught to actually be in relationship to her feelings and desires. And so I was trying to figure out how to write into desire and into feeling for a woman in the 50s in a place like Colombia. You know, like what would that been like? And also to make the grandmother even more complex and more nuanced as a person that is not only relationship. And I also, you know, I also sometimes feel like grandmothers in stories, and sometimes very much in like immigrant stories and Latino stories, they become a little bit of comic relief at times. And I wanted her, I mean, she is comic relief at times, and she is funny, and she says like ridiculous things, and but also like she's such a point of connection for Francisca. They connect a lot, and I want her to explore. And I didn't know that the whole thing with the nun was going to happen. I just started exploring, and I was like, oh my God, this is great. What if she actually had some sort of like queer desire that at the time, I mean, homoerotic, I wouldn't even call it queer, this homoerotic desire that was unnameable, or just, desires that were unnameable? What would have that been like? So I did research on the time period, and just trying to write into that, and into just having no language to explore like who you are. And I also really like writing historical fiction. I just have to say, like, it was just like, so, I mean, and I love reading it. I also like, that's why like I didn't love the book. I like ate it up because I was like, oh my God, I love it. Yeah, it was like, it's so beautiful.
Thank you.
And like, I just love historical fiction. I just love learning about like people through like story. So yeah, so that was a lot around that. It's like I wanted them to be more complex. I wanted them to not only exist in relationship to this character, I wanted them to have their own stories as well as teenagers in these very specific places in Colombia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that just like deepens the richness. And when we return to Francisca, we have, just all of these additional dimensions of perspective on her and her journey. So it's really very, I don't want to give too much away, but it's really moving, and it gives this novel yet another layer of depth, and power. So I'm wondering if we could come back to whiteness for a moment. You mentioned the assumption of whiteness in the English that was taught in schools, so-called standard English, and the kind of flattening of that in relation to the flattening effect of that in relation to the language that you were hearing in community. And I wonder if you could talk a little about maybe in relation to the Spanglish itself, or even with the telling of a story, kind of the process of freeing yourself from the white gaze. And I want to maybe contextualize it a little even more. So many of us writers are deeply inspired by Toni Morrison in her sort of refusal to write to the her refusal to write to the white gaze, and her writing Blackness from Within. And she said, and having really sort of blown a lot of people's minds when she first said, I write for Black people. And there's so many white interviewers are like, really? But what did, how do you mean write for? And she would say, Tolstoy wrote for Russians. We can all read them. We can all read Tolstoy and benefit from Tolstoy, but he wrote for Russians. What's wrong with that? And she also had this line that she said about being called a Black woman writer. She was asked by a white interviewer, does it bother you to be called a Black woman writer? And she said, I can accept the label because being a Black woman writer is not a shallow place, but a rich place to write from. It doesn't limit my imagination, it expands it. Mm-hmm. So I kind of wanted to put all of that out there and say, It feels like there's so much power and freedom in this book, like it's really writing from inside of its own truth. Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I love that you're bringing Toni Morrison up, because I read Beloved while I was writing this book. The voice in that book is just like incredible. I mean, what she was able to manage to do with voice, it's beautiful, and I think it's also very powerful because it is written for Black people. And I think that you can sense that in the aesthetic and in the texture of the language. One of the most beautiful things that has happened with this book that I didn't know was going to happen was a lot of people have reached out to me, that they like the book and here and that. A lot of people of Latin American descent here, or just people in Latin America, have reached out to me and said how they've always feared using Spanglish, and that there was something very freeing about reading the book, that they always feared like that they were going to be looked down upon, that they will always fear like using an accent, that they had been toning to other accents even unconsciously, even people who are like activists and stuff like that, that the use of Spanglish is very much seen as like less than that. There was something very freeing about the book, and those moments have been very, very beautiful for me. There's a lot of Colombians also in the States that have reached out to me, like talking to me about the way that I feel seen by the language, right? But this fusion. When I was writing this book, I feel that there was there was a deep wanting my own like linguistic legitimacy around what I was experiencing in the world. And I also just like really like it. I just feel like it's like really fun and incredible. And that's something that like, you know, on a very intuitive level, it just really calls on me. I grew up listening to my tias talking in the living room, my grandmother speaking. Like my storytelling comes from all these women speaking. And then when I moved to the States, there were all these women still speaking, and now there was this incorporation of all this English in it. I don't necessarily think that I was setting out to do something against the white gaze. I just feel that I am not very, I wasn't conscious of it. I just wanted to do what I wanted to do. And I feel like that in itself is doing something against it. I was just very much interested in the story, and I have read a lot of immigrant stories where it is a lot about reacting to whiteness, reacting to like the white world around it. How do you assimilate? How do you, and I also just wanted to be like, my people are fucked up too, and that doesn't make them any less human. Like immigrants can be really complex. Like everybody in the book is Colombian mostly, and they're all fucked up to each other, and we still deserve our humanity, right? Like we don't have to be exemplary, like respectable immigrants to have access to our humanity. And I feel like a lot of it comes from there. It's like I don't have to show you an exemplary Latino narrative. I'm not interested in that, you know. I'm interested in like these real stories, and they all happen to be Latin American because those are the people that I grew up with, and I'm obsessed with our lives, and I'm obsessed with their world. So those are the people that are the closest to me. And you know, Colombians, and I was very obsessed with my upbringing in the States. The years that I spent with all my tias and my grandmother locked in this little tiny apartment, going to church and all this shit, that my life was completely uprooted from another country and came here. And the people who were evil to me were my own family. You know, it's like, I don't know, like, yeah, I mean, I wasn't really aware of like structural racism and I was a fucking teenager who wanted to get like high and was like in this swampy place, you know, and like hated it. So I think a lot comes from very much seeing my people as human beings and wanted to put them in like a story, and like not really being interested with being a respectable like immigrant at all.
That's really powerful. I mean, we don't have to do things with the primary intent of them being an act of resistance for them to be an act of resistance, right? And that's something that's powerful there. And I kind of bring in the word resistance, knowing, you know, that you are, you know, this incredible writer, you know, and also an activist, that you've done a lot of literary activism, right? With Radar Productions and the work that you did there, curating literary community, and also, and, you know, like queer-centered literary community, and also in the Dignidad Literaria movement. We were at a town hall together, right, earlier this spring. I think it was February 2020.
It was right before,
in reaction to American Dirt and kind of the ensuing Dignidad Literaria conversation around Latinx representation in literature, and that you've been, you know, that you have this activist lens as well as having this aesthetic and artistic lens of making art, you know, that's very layered. I'm actually teaching this book in an MFA seminar that is the art of subtext in fiction. So we're looking at subtext and how do you speak the unspeakable, and where does subtext kind of live and vibrate in works. And we're rereading all Latin American and Latinx literatures for that theme. We haven't talked about your book yet, but I can't wait.
I wanted to say one last thing about this idea of the white gaze, which is that in my experience and in writing Radar and seeing so many queer people of color go through the different programs and hearing them read, I feel like there's a lot of pressure in this country when you're some sort of minority to perform your identity constantly, and to perform an identity that is legible to others.
Yes.
And sometimes that legibility unconsciously is kind of like replicating the white gaze, because, you know, like that is the white gaze. And so I've seen that, and I've seen how constricting it is for a lot of people to have to be constantly performing. Like, you know, I have like performing Latino, like we're performing queerness, performing Blackness, performing, you know, just to be legible. And well, one, I don't like to be told what to do ever. That's just part of my personality. I'm like, you can't be telling me what to do. I'm gonna do whatever I want. But it's also just like, you know, I am so many things, and like, you know, Latinos, the way that I exist in this country because of the history of this country. But I grew up in a place where I wasn't an identity like that. I grew up in a place where I was just, everybody was speaking Colombian around me. I didn't have all these things imposed on me. And so, you know, we were all just humans, and like we were just like fucked up. And so I really bring a lot of that with me when it comes to this country, and I'm perceived as like a stereotype many times, but I have it in me. I grew up in a place where I wasn't. So it's very much alive inside of me, that I know what to be real and what to be true for myself, that I don't have to perform it to other people, you know? Yeah, so it's like, I feel like that's also what delivering feel comes with, like we don't have to perform a specific sense of ourselves to be whatever we are. You know, like our ancestry is with us regardless of that, right? Like I know who I am, I know where I come from. And that's going to be with me regardless of whether people read me as Colombian or as Latino, whatever, in my work or not. I mean, it just happens to be so freaking like Spanglish, so like it's very obvious. But like if it wasn't, you know, it's like whatever. Like it's just more like I'm okay. I know who I am. I have so much love for myself and for the place where I'm from, and that's so alive inside me, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't have to perform for any particular reason. It already is. And I think that's such a powerful place from which to write, right? From this truth that is already alive inside you. I mean, I love that phrasing, and thinking about this living, breathing truth from which to create art, right? And artistic expressions. Would you be willing to read to us a little bit more from the book?
Yes. Let's do another very short reading. Okay, so I'm going to actually just start with the very first page. Since we're coming to an end of a conversation, I'm going to start with the beginning.
Yes.
Chapter 1. Buenos días, mi reina. Immigrant criolla here reporting desde los Miamis from our ant-infested townhouse. The broken air conditioner above the TV, the flowery couch. La tata half-drunk directing me in this holy radionovela brought to you by Female Sadness Incorporated. That morning, as we unpacked the last of our bags, we found Tata's old radio. So the two of us practiced our latest melodrama in the living room. While on the TV, Don Francisco saluted El Pueblo de Miami, damas y caballeros. And Tata, at this age, Mommy's exasperation and my delight went girl crazy over his manly voice. Y como quien no quiere la cosa, Mommy angrily turned up the stove, where La Tata had left the bacalao frying unattended. Then Lysol sprayed the countertop, smashing the dark trail of ants, hustling from pancito for the colony behind the fridge. Girlfriend was pissed. She hadn't come to the US of A to kill ants and smell like puto pescado. And how lovely it would have been if the housekeeper could have joined us on the plane. Then Mommy could leave her to the household duties and concentrate on the execution of this migration project. Pero aló, is she the only person awake in esta berraca casa? That's right.
Bravo! So good. So, I mean, just even a couple of moments, even thinking about the lens of how we're reading this book in a class on subtext, just on the pure level of craft. Like, you had me at the first sentence, Buenos días, mi reina. And that immediate address, that kind of like, you know, like Melville does in Moby Dick, right? Like, call me Ishmael. Immediately, we are pulled into conversation with this narrator. And we're called mi reina. Like, do we take it? Do we own it? Is that what we are? You know, it's just this like incredibly multi-layered 4-word opening, you know, and even that it is boldly in Spanish. And like, mi reina is an address that is uniquely extant in Spanish or Spanglish, you know.
Yeah.
So like that opening is just so richly vibrating with subtext already. And then another example in the first paragraph is this holy radio novela or radionovela, depending, brought to you by, and then these are capitalized words, Female Sadness Incorporated. It's so good. It's so good, right? Because it's got so much going on. Again, talk about subtext, like the holy radio novela. And we're kind of riding along. We feel the humor. We feel the irony. We're like, this is a teenager who's like, she is just they up to here, and then it's Female Sadness Incorporated, and it's absolutely simultaneously funny and witty and kind of a send up of something and mad poignant. And like, you kind of like, dang, Female Sadness Incorporated, where are we? Right? So all of these things are happening in these, in just these few exquisitely chosen words.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for saying that. I think about female sadness a lot, and I was writing about female sadness simultaneously. I was just writing it just because I grew up with so many women, so many sad women also around me. The Buenos Dias, mi reina, I have to say that some of this language, and you see it throughout, and I feel like if you're Colombian, you can sense it, or maybe just in Latin America. In Colombia, and I grew up in Bogota, and you're walking around the streets, there are people inviting you to buy things, and it's like, venga mi reina, sin compromiso, venga por acá, and you're always a queen, you're always, like, they want you to feel like, so I'm bringing in this like street language from Bogota that is, it's like, there's some wings that are like, there's wings to the queer community, because I called it in some of the voguing house language. There's wings to like Colombians with this stuff. But I definitely was like feeling, and now when I was in Colombia, just back in December, that when you're walking down a busy street and everybody's trying to sell you something, it's like, Renita, venga pa acá, Renita, venga, le muestro, venga, mi amor, venga, and they're calling you mi amor, mi vida, mi corazón, to just get that intimate feeling and like trying to reel you in to sell you something. So this is the way that she's selling you the book.
So they're selling you the book. It's kind of a lure, and she's kind of like this, like really, savvy salesperson at the same time. So it's even more layers. Yeah. In Uruguay, you walk down the street, and people aren't going to call you mi reina. I'm sad to say. I can't speak for all Latin American countries, but no, mi reina. That's like a person in with you, So, but I love it. That's such a beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, it is like, that's the way of selling you stuff. And I also grew up very much with a father who really know how to regatear, regatear in English, like a prize. And, he was just like so good at talking and like getting somebody to like lower the price. And as a kid, I would go and I would just feel so much shame. My dad was so good at that kind of talking. Venga, China, le digo que no sé qué. And it was just like this, like the way that like language and storytelling moves in on the streets as people are trying to sell you or lure you into whatever hustle they have. Because it's all about like luring you into their hustle. I love that. And I experience here this in the mission, when I go out of my house, the first thing I hear is a señora in the corner telling you $2 churro. $2 churro, $2 churro, $2 churro, $2
Right.
So, it's like, I love that.
Yeah, eso sí, that was traditional in Uruguay, like the people walking in the market and the vendedores, all the...
Yeah.
It's so powerful. I'm so glad you ended up reading this. First of all, because the opportunity to really nerd out about craft on the level, on the sentence level with the book, and also to get that extra read of the subtext, right? Of like luring you with their hustle. And you think about a narrator luring you in with their hustle. That's really powerful. Yeah. So cool.
That's literally. Go ahead.
And, and then luring you in, and it's a whole, and then you're in the world, and it's the whole world, and it just speaks to the power of what a novel can do.
Yeah.
So such an incredible novel. And my last question for you would be, I know that you're still working and creating. Can you tell us what you're working on? What's sort of next for you as a writer?
Yeah, so, I mean, I've been working on a new novel for the past, like, maybe year and a half. Right now, it's the title is Poppy. We'll see if that changes. And it's a story told from 2 points of view. It's about this girl who has a puppy, his father, and her mom dies when she's 8. And Poppy has had all these secrets in a very closeted life. So the mom dies, and she's now being raised by trans women and gay men around her. So the story is being told by the trans woman head of the house, and she tells you the story of Poppy's dark past in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in the underground party scene in Bogota. And then Lucia tells like the narrative present of what's going on and like all the different secrets. So it's all very much around like unraveling Poppy's dark secrets around like the mom's death and like, all the stuff around it. So it's interesting because I'm figure, well, first it took me forever to figure out the point of view, but also I'm writing in Spanglish and it's all happening in Colombia. It's all happening in Colombia. And I went there for 2 months to do research on the queer life of the 80s and 90s there. So we'll see when it comes. I mean, it's a lot of work, you know, and it's a lot of work to figure out like everything. But yeah, the girl's a little younger. It's like she's 11, 12 years old. So it's a little bit more like child turning into a teenager thing. Yeah,
that's so exciting. It's so exciting.
It's the first like really queer, and then like the trans woman's Tia Mama's voice. It's a dream to be able to write. That's like my favorite thing right now to be writing, because I can just lash out in this like very like faggy, queeny way, and telling the story of the queer life of the city in the 80s.
That's so powerful. And that's another thing that fiction can do, right, is narrate into the silences of history. Silence, not because it didn't happen, but because it didn't always get recorded, right? It hasn't always been made visible in the larger mainstream story of cultural history. So thank you for doing that work to unearth it, you know?
And like what you did, for instance, we can put us, I mean, I keep thinking about how people assume that queer history, not only in the US, but in the world, really begins with Stonewall. And it's not true.
Not true.
And like our people in different countries, I mean, developing countries have been doing queerness for a really long time and advancing a lot of things. And mostly a lot of sex workers, mostly a lot of people that have been hustling on the streets. And like, that's true in Colombia as well. And so I love reading Cantora so much. That was like, I loved it. And it was so incredible, but it was also just really about like this world building for all these women, and like they only had each other as a point of reference, and like you know, like it's like
it was the only queer community they knew, right? They were the only queer community they knew, and that was true. This is based on real women who found each other in the late 70s and formed a friendship. And there was no queer community center. There's no website. There was a dictatorship going on. You know, that's it.
But they were doing it, right? And they were like, you know, they did the little bar in the like the basement and all that stuff. And it's like there's all these things that were constantly happening that even now I feel like even in our countries, and I'll speak for Colombia, like sometimes it just gets looked at like the US or Europe as the advancement of queerness. And our queerness has a very different sensibility and aesthetic and texture. And I'm really trying to like sit with that.
Right. And my country of origin, Uruguay, legalized gay marriage before the US did.
That's right.
Right? And Argentina was the first, then Canada, and then I think it was Argentina, Canada, and then Uruguay before the US. So like even just on that one particular, it's not the only litmus of queer rights or liberation or visibility, but on that particular lineage, like Latin America was in some parts ahead of where the US was. So I'm saying that to shatter that assumption, right? That it's all US centered. We have so many histories. Yeah. So thank you for doing that cultural work of like bringing those histories into your.
We'll see what happens. You know, you start with an idea. I mean, I've been writing for a year and a half, and then it just shows up very differently. So don't get your hopes up. Who knows?
Well, I'm already cheering and I'm already here for it. I'm so excited. Thank you so much for spending the time to have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. This was really wonderful. So good to see you.
So good to see you.
I hope to see you in person sometime in the next year.
I know, I hope so. I hope so. Y mientras tanto, adelante.
Mientras tanto, adelante, sí. Gracias.
Muchísimas gracias. Adiós.